I would like to comment on something that I think is extremely important to the efforts of this conference as regards contributions of science to the issue before us here, which is kind of the nature of the world and our role in it. And these are all somewhat personal, having to do with my own interactions with people. And the first is an interaction with Heisenberg. And this in connection with what we heard today about the cosmology. The original Copenhagen interpretation was really about human beings doing experiments that we do here and now and making predictions about them. I wrote a paper called The Copenhagen Interpretation, and that was published in a journal, American Journal of Physics, in 1972. And Heisenberg, I asked Heisenberg to comment upon it, and he basically was complimentary, but he said one question. He said, what about the world before there was any life? And his answer, which was the question raised today, cosmology, his answer was to first cite Plato. Plato's ideas, you know, Plato had the idea of an idealism. There are some ideas out there that are existing somehow apart from human beings and that we're able to access. And his answer was that he thought it was necessary to consider, not in his words, but effectively, an objective mind. So he, as an extension of the Copenhagen interpretation into cosmology, he said, essentially, you need a cosmic mind, and referred to Plato's ideas about ideas existing. So that's interesting how he answered this question. By the way, that ties in pretty closely with Hameroff was raising questions about Penrose. And as you probably know, Penrose's answer to these questions was very similar from a different standpoint. How do we have mathematical intuition? And he ultimately ended up citing Plato, idealism, and so his answer to the question was also a Platonic idealism. In other words, there are ideas out there that are somehow apart from our human ideas. So again, we're talking about, they're not using the word cosmic mind or anything like this, but that's basically what both of these answers were. They were cosmic mind. And now, the next topic I want to talk about is when Seiler gave his very nice talk, he emphasized Rudolph Hogg and Hogg's view, and he briefly mentioned that Hogg's view had to do with Whiteheadian ideas, and so he described, and the ideas of Hogg were basically, by the way, Hogg wrote an article, and I communicated with him. He, after he wrote an article, put a subscript saying that, or a postscript saying that actually I had come up with the same sort of Whiteheadian view. And in fact, in my book, I call my main chapter Whiteheadian Interpretation of Quantum Mechanics. And as was mentioned this morning, the Whiteheadian view is that there are these events, and they're psychophysical events that are located in certain regions of space, and the way they are described is psychophysical. In other words, there's a mental aspect that's coming in, and it causes some particular thing to happen in some particular region. And so that was the main idea of Hogg's idea. It's all a Whiteheadian idea, which is basically some sort of overmind that's coming in and causing these events to happen in certain space-time regions. So again, we're moving in that direction of something beyond human mind, but it's mind-like. And the final comment is in Seiler's talk, he described all of these different possibilities and pointed out they have Nobel Prize winners and others supporting all of these different views. But he didn't try to, pin them down and really examine anyone and say, are they all really correct? Are they possible? Are they rational? In that connection, I wrote a paper pointing out that at least for the many worlds interpretation and also for the so-called environmental decoherence interpretation, that they were not fully rational for the reasons I mentioned in my earlier talk, namely this impossibility of getting discrete questions out of a continuum. And by the way, the final thing I have to say is that I wrote that back in '02, and there's never been any sort of rebuttal. And I did talk to a number of Zay and Zurich and others. And just last week, 1 week ago today, there appeared in the Physics Archives a paper that looked at all 8 of the most prominent interpretations of quantum theory and basically said that all 8 of them suffered effectively from the same defect that I talked about and mentioned to you at this conference. So all of these add up, it seemed to me, in the same direction. They're all saying that somehow mind is more than human mind and that there's some sort of a cosmic mind. These are all from various different sources, Whitehead. And so in any case, I think it's all moving in the same direction. And
thank you, Henry. I think, a lot of people, by the way, thank you. A lot of people would, in our secular world right now, be more comfortable with objective mind as the phrase. I like that, objective mind. Well, it's kind of neutral, right? If you want to respond, Arad, because he was referring a lot to your lecture, you want to respond, or you want to say anything right now?
Okay. Since you mentioned Rudolph Tanzi, well, I don't think that idea, which somehow has a lot of attraction to me, that idea would be not so much a cosmic mind. I think he would not really support that, but rather that these events happen spontaneously. Yeah, I don't know, I cannot say much more about it.
Okay, that's good. Spontaneous is a good word, actually, because it really doesn't explain anything, but it's good enough, spontaneous.
We don't understand it.
Yeah, we don't. Yeah.
The Whitehead idea is basically cosmic mind. And
okay, I think... Well,
can I add, he brought up Platonic values. And
okay, so say something.
Yeah, so Henry mentioned that the Penrose idea includes Platonic values. So the basic idea, it would predate humans and life, in fact, that anywhere there's a superposition, which is actually a separation in the fine-scale structure of the universe, which, if it continued, would give you multiple worlds. But instead, there's an instability, which at a time t, the collapse occurs, and the two possibilities, one will be chosen over the other, and the other one dies off. Now, the choices between those two, in conventional quantum mechanics, would be random. But in the Penrose formulation, the choice is influenced by Platonic values embedded in the fine-scale structure of the universe, which means it's kind of like a crooked roulette wheel, except towards a good thing. So Platonic values would be aesthetic and ethical values, goodness, perhaps, consciousness. Pardon me?
Evolution.
Well, evolution's one more point, and that is that in the book I'm writing, I'm challenging the idea that evolution is, natural selection is based on survival of the fittest. I think natural selection and evolution is based on promoting good feelings and consciousness. Even in the very simple, most basic collapses, there's a feeling. In the ones that are happening all around us, they're not organized and not meaningful. It takes our brains to make them completely meaningful. But so that's what I think drove evolution.
Okay, thanks. Before I get to you, and I actually was going to go to you and Rudy because you guys haven't spoken anything. I think the basic problem still remains, how do we experience anything? Okay, right now, as you're looking at me or you're looking at anyone else, all that's coming to your eyes is photons. I think no one would disagree. Okay, what's happening in your retina is some kind of chemical reaction. There's an electrical current going to your brain, and in your brain, correct me if I'm wrong, there's some neurochemistry, right? There's electrochemistry. So far, everything seems reasonable. But then suddenly, you have a three-dimensional world, pretty huge, including the cosmos. How does that happen? How does a photon coming to your eyes give me the experience of a three-dimensional world in space and time?
This is the crux of the matter. The question is how a universe which is at its foundation, quantum mechanical, appear to us
Classical.
That it's not the other way around. That is the main problem. How a basically quantum universe appear as objects and separate observers which are not connected to each other. That's
So every time I open my eyes, am I converting a quantum world into a classical world?
basically, I think what we're saying is that at the very foundational level, maybe it is at the space-time foundational level, or maybe even below, there are these universal principles which limit this undivided, eternal wholeness that we call the conscious reality. They limit it because without the limitation, we will all be experiencing oneness. So for the sake of creation and for the experience of the universe, these limiting principles at a very fundamental level manifest the universe.
Rudy, you're a neuroscientist. I've asked you this question. I have another question to ask you. I mean, you look at synaptic networks all the time, but what's happening?
Well, you know, in training as a neuroscientist, you're taught that it's enough to know connections between brain regions to learn how synapses fire, to strengthen each other, to create action potentials. So we have a pretty good understanding of how, as information comes in, we can record that information, associate it with other information we already have. So for one event that you remember, you may remember it 5 different ways depending on what you associate it with in your brain. So we have a good idea about recording information, recalling it, and associating it with other information. But what we don't have a good handle on is simply awareness. What does consciousness require? Consciousness requires awareness and attention. In some cases,
Volition.
awareness and an intention with volition. So where's awareness come from? Simply being aware, just the quality of life. Well, you could say, well, sensory information is being brought in as electrochemical signals, which are then turning on synapses in the brain. But in terms of the experience, I can remember, a certain feeling, I had, when our child was born. I can recall that feeling, that emotion. How is that stored? Maybe, yes, microtubules. But I think this is the next frontier. Will the Hameroff-Penrose hypothesis reign? But this is the big question: is where is the JPEG of my mother's face when I picture her face? How do I recall in detail a certain emotional experience that actually hits me back in my breathing again? When you have a wonderful experience in life. This is what we don't have a clear idea of. We know how it's recorded, recalled, and associated.
So I was listening to Leonard's talk, and one thing that I totally got from his lecture was that first, memory is unreliable, and secondly, actually every time you recognize a thing, you recreate it. So it's not, remembering is recreation. And so from the philosophical point of Vedanta, the memory actually only exists as a potential till you actualize it. Okay? Huh?
It's not completely reconstructed. It's just refined and changed.
It's not completely.
Microphone, Michael.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying that the memory, whenever we have a new memory or recalling an incident, it's not just completely reconstructed. There's a a core to it. You can tweak it by retelling it or whatever, but there's still a core to it. But let me just comment on. You go ahead.
Well, okay. Well, I don't want to take you on a tangent, but so that's true. Usually there is a core to it, and like I showed the picture of the roadside, the data you get is fuzzy, but the image you create from that is a sharp one. And memory works that way, where you generally have some data and you recreate it, but it doesn't always work that way. You can actually recreate a memory that seems real, that has no basis at all, a false memory. There are ways that psychologists have of actually inducing you to recreate memories that are not even related to anything that actually happened to you.
Okay, so let me just ask one question to kind of further this along. Everyone right now, and keep your eyes open or closed, imagine a beautiful sunset on the ocean. Can you see a picture? Can you? Where's the picture, gentlemen?
Well, I know what Stuart will
Right
say.
there.
so-
Right, visual cortex, right here.
Over here? There's no picture there. There's electrochemistry.
Well, yeah, that's right.
So where's the picture? You're not seeing electrochemicals.
How are the data stored, including microtubules? Are there other possibilities? This is the next frontier. We really don't have a handle on this. Even when you talk about recreating a memory, you're talking about synaptic firing to turn on certain neurocircuitry to recall certain events. The question is, where are those and how are those events stored as sensory information, including pictures, smells, feelings?
Yeah, and we don't really understand that very well. But there are some hints about the storage of, for instance, visual information. When I showed that slide that showed how the Gallant's group in Berkeley reconstructed what people were seeing through the MRI data, through fMRI data, and part of that, the reason they could do that is that the actual visual information was being geographically stored in certain parts of your brain, faithfully maintaining certain geographical relationships. So that's how the layout could come. So I mean, of course, no one knows the great details of that, but I mean, there is evidence that there is a correspondence between the state of the neurons and what you experience, which doesn't explain what the experience is, but something corresponding to your experience is going on.
But a synapse, basically, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, a synapse basically is an on-off switch, right? Right? No? Yes?
Well,
it's an on-off switch. Huh?
The firing is all on the dendritic side, it's graded. It's analog. It's
Okay.
analog on the dendritic side, on the synapse, and on the axon side.
You know, I have an apartment in New York where I can put on all kinds of on-off switches. In every room, I can switch on the electricity in this room and television in there and adjust the lighting. I'm not assuming that those switches are producing the electricity or the phenomenon. They're just switching them on and off. Let Bernardo speak. He hasn't said a word.
I think we should at least entertain the possibility that the question you raise, which is extraordinarily relevant in the context of our culture today, at bottom may be a categorical confusion, a ghost of our abstractions. Let me try to elaborate on this quickly and link that back to objective consciousness, which is, I think is a very relevant concept. Ultimately, if we step back and look at the situation very skeptically, ultimately, the only carrier of reality that we can know for sure is subjective experience itself, with all its qualities. That's the primary datum of reality. That's where it all starts from. The idea of a world fundamentally outside consciousness and independent of consciousness is an inference that we make in consciousness, perhaps for very good logical reasons, but it's an inference, not necessarily an established empirical fact. Now, what do? We make this inference, an inference of consciousness, a projection of our psyches, and then we try to reduce the primary datum of existence, conscious experience itself, to an abstraction of consciousness. In other words, we chase our own tails at light speed, and we create problems that may not exist at all. An alternative way of looking at this might be to say, let's go back to objective consciousness, which I think we have to be very careful about attributing too many properties to objective consciousness without reason. For me, objective consciousness means a psychic capacity that does not fall under the control of volition. In other words, we cannot control with our will, and which we do not identify with. We have proof that that exists every day when we dream. We don't identify with the part of our minds that generate our dreams, and we can't control it. Maybe reality arises from a collective part of mind, and I say that without contradiction, because if all reality is in consciousness, the fact that our bodies are separate does not imply that mind is fundamentally separate as well. There may be a part of our minds, an objective consciousness, which is responsible for our reality. And then the brain would be simply the image of a particular process in that objective consciousness, which would explain all correlations between subjective experience and brain activity, not the cause of consciousness. I think if we look at the world this way, we would stop chasing our own tails, and things would be explained in a very skeptical, parsimonious way, without postulating all these entities like matter fundamentally outside consciousness, which is unprovable. I would claim as unnecessary as the flying spaghetti monster, despite good logical reasons for inferring this material reality. I think they could all be tackled one by one. And by the way, I would enjoy going through this exercise with Michael at some point, if he wants to. Maybe not here now today, but at some point.
Okay. I think we would like to open it up to you guys to ask anyone any question. Neil, you have a comment before? Go ahead if you have a comment. You sure? Kamran. Kamran is an internet entrepreneur from Silicon Valley. After making a few, these days it's always a billion, he decided to enjoy life.
Okay. I was enjoying life while I was creating my companies too, and life is full of joy. But thanks for the introduction, Deepak. I guess coming back from computer science and electronics background, I'm a little bit confused by your question, Deepak. If through fMRI you could sense a certain level of difference that is readable on the neurons, whether it's 0 and 1 or some shade of gray that changes, then it's just a simple memory. And you know, in our field, in microelectronics, not only we started with core memory and then went to solid state, and we started to do this now for years and years, at least 5 years, we have had organic memories, and you know, various different laboratories have been using living material and saving the things and reading off of that. So I'm a little bit confused on when you say, where is this picture stored? It is on the whole array of neurons. Now, array does not need to be a matrix that is perfectly organized. If brain has got it's kind of like a mesh network, the array could be a virtual matrix that's created by this, and I can simply design it for you on how you can have that.
The word that's used in neuroscience these days is NCC, neural correlates of consciousness. So even when you have that virtual memory, the word is virtual. What we are asking is, how does the experience occur? The experience.
That's the. He resurrected what I wanted to say.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, first off, exactly, I think it's a key point. The reason we always say neural correlates of consciousness is because they're merely correlations. And whereas there may be a somewhat dominant cultural trend to say the correlation means the brain is creating the state of experience, that doesn't necessarily follow. And everyone up here is tired of hearing, well, several of the people up here are tired of me saying it, but you don't expect to open a radio and see a band. You know that that's transducing radio waves that are infinite in extent, and you're fine-tuning a focus down to select something out that turns it back into an experience of music for our human eardrums. But you could turn it into light or whatever. So another alternative explanation is the brain is a transducer of the consciousness that is out there. You don't have to assume the correlation means the brain creates the state. It might be the state is operating through the brain to be experienced by us as adapted humans. But the other thing is, this goes to what I was saying before about the kinds of data that are often not allowed into discourse, even though they're demonstrable, repetitive. I work with I'm a liver pathologist as my day job, and I've spent 25 years working with liver transplant teams. Anyone who's worked with a liver transplant team has met patients that have memories of their donors. And the first time I experienced that, it was a very dramatic situation where one of our patients, after a liver transplant, woke up screaming night after night in the intensive care unit from this nightmare. And the nightmare was repetitive, and it turned out what he was dreaming, because eventually we went through the bureaucracy because he wanted to know, of allowing his family to communicate with the donor's family, because normally there are barriers up to keep that from happening. He was dreaming the death of the donor, and it was a very disturbing, violent death. So something else was going on there, and a lot of, I tell this story in a room, and there's always people who are going, wow, see, that's amazing, and there are people going, that's impossible. If it were just my story, it would be impossible, but people have studied this. Anyone who's worked with a transplant team has seen this as a repetitive thing. So the idea that the memory simply correlates with an array of neurons that can be then accessed, that's kind of tough too. I'm not saying that, that implies definitively that it's the other way around. I think we don't know. But it's premature to shut off any possible hypothesis at this point.
Kira, you have somebody asking a question there?
Go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us who the question's for.
Hi, this is Zappy, Deepak. How are you? I just, am been sitting here all day, and it's been amazing, but it almost seems like, hearkening back to something that you said to me, Deepak, when we were filming, is sort of, you don't know how you're growing your hair, you don't know how you're beating your heart. Like, how can you basically know anything except that it's a total miracle, and you should just wake up every day and embrace the fact that it's a total miracle and not even, necessarily try to figure out who's right, because if you don't know who's beating your heart, how could you know?
Well, scientists don't talk in terms of miracles, but I am reminded of a statement that Einstein once made. He says, either nothing is a miracle or assume that everything is. I mean, the fact is, we don't know what existence is or why existence is. What scientists try to do is try to quantify happenings and find mechanisms, and that's what we're struggling with this right now.
Can I very briefly comment on that? Even if it is a miracle, there is no harm in at least trying to understand what are the patterns and regularities behind this miracle, right? After all, it is this miracle and not some other miracle that tells us something. I think there is no harm in trying to understand that a little further than to just say, it's a miracle, so let's just give up.
I think the problem with consciousness, the only place where you start to wonder what's the gap, is the initiation of intention or volition from the motor side. Once I get my motor cortex going, everything is obvious, right? So the first step this way, and the last step that way. How does the photon going inside? And then you have synesthesia, where you have visual stimuli translating into auditory stimuli. How does that happen? What is that all about?
Do you want me to answer, or?
Yeah, go ahead.
I will stop short of the synesthesia question. I will address the more fundamental point you raised before. I think our efforts to try to explain how the brain with electrochemical activity generates the qualities of subjective experience are analogous to asking how does a whirlpool generate water. It's the wrong question. The brain is just the image of a process in consciousness, because consciousness, for all we know, for all we can ever know, is the ontological primitive. It is the only certain fact of existence. If the brain is just an image of a particular process, like a localization in the stream of consciousness, like a whirlpool is a localization in the stream of water, we are asking ourselves, how does the whirlpool generate water? We will never find this answer. We will chase our tails forever. That's my take on this.
I want to comment on what Neil said. I agree with you completely about the transplant patients. I'm an anesthesiologist, and I did anesthesia in my younger days, a lot of cardiac anesthesia for transplants, and got to know our heart transplant surgeons pretty well. And they were always talking about memories that when they see these patients in clinic, they say, I got this sudden craving for avocados or something, or I love to dance now, and all this kind of stuff. And they tracked them down, and sure enough, the donor had those traits, and the only way I can explain it is that, as Rudy said, I think the memories in microtubules in the brain, but they're microtubules in all the organs, including the heart. So the heart has a big nerve ganglia, a lot of nerve ganglia with a lot of nerves and microtubules. I just also want to address your question of how, because nobody answered it, how we get a three-dimensional picture from a two-dimensional. And I think there's more to it than what hits the retina. Who was talking about that today? Leonard, I guess. Because, for example, all the photons that hit the rhodopsin in the back go through cilia, which can extract quantum information. So I think in some way that really needs to be worked out. We are entangled with what's out there. And somebody just said it, Bernardo, that there's consciousness out there, and we become entangled with it. So I think something that radical is going to be needed.
Michael.
Well, I was just going to offer a small voice of skepticism on the dream interpretation and the organ transplant stuff. I don't know if there's actually controlled studies or these are anecdotes, but there's only so many variations of dreams, and we all have them. Flying dreams, floating dreams, anxiety dreams, sense presence dreams. Everybody has them. So it would be pretty easy to find a pattern connection. Like, I think I had that nightmare. Well, we've all had these kinds of nightmares. You're shaking your head no, because this was a really, really special. Well, I mean,
my dream life is not so easily classified into a finite number of categories.
Well,
I've never heard anyone even try to say that.
Even if it's 50 different dreams that people have, if you have a million transplant patients.
These are not categories of dreams. These are very detailed, specific, memory-like reconstructions of an event that has independent verification.
Independent verification, what does that mean?
In this case, it was a newspaper report of this young woman who was chased into an alley, raped, and then shot. And so she was brain dead, but her organs were available for use. And this guy was dreaming being chased into an alley, raped as a woman, and then a gun appears before his face, and he wakes up screaming before the gun goes off. Okay. That kind of detail.
Okay, that's very specific. But how many transplant patients have had dreams that you verified did not come true? There was no connection. In other words, the misses. We have to know the misses, not just the hits, because you can always find unusual anecdotes that stand out.
But you could generalize dreams, and so it could just be a statistical. Does anyone have that repetitive dream life in this room?
There's millions of transplants. How many people have no dreams at all?
I just want to say that there, you're describing it as if it were vividly, point for point, exactly true, and I'm skeptical about that. I think that, in the translation, in the memory, in the processing, in the checking, these things get changed. I had an experience. I had a recurring dream that I saw a plane crash, and all the debris went up and was falling on me, and I had to hide from it. It was in a field, usually. Okay, then I happened to be at the World Trade Center at 9/11 when the plane came in, and I had that experience where I had to run away from the debris that came down when the plane crashed into the first tower. They're not exactly the same, but I could see how one could say that was the dream. I had a premonition over all those years, and you could equate those two. Some details are different, and of course, no one would expect a dream, even if it were a memory of the past, to be exactly the same. But I didn't do that. But I can see how one could say these were exactly the same dream.
On the other hand, given the strength of the data that Dean Radin can produce about precognition experiments, 10 to the minus 20th power, you have to wonder at least whether we have to entertain it as a possible hypothesis. I'm willing to admit that maybe you're correct. Your unwillingness to admit that maybe the other side is correct is a kind of rigidity and dogmatic orthodoxy that smacks to me of fundamentalist religion.
Okay.
Wait, before Michael answers that, let me say that your accusation that I'm unwilling to admit that such things might be correct is not based on anything other than your prejudgment of what I really believe, because we never even talked about whether I'd be willing to entertain anything like that.
What I'm thinking, before you go, Michael, I think a case could be made that you guys are not skeptical enough.
Okay, so...
Because...
All right, to make this a scientific question, we'd have to know, let's just take the entire database of, in a year, how many people got transplants of any organ. And then we ask, let's say 1 out of 100 of them, how many dreams have you had that were unusual or stood out or not? And so maybe it's 1 out of 100, or maybe it's 50 out of 100. Do you know how many transplant patients? Do you have a number?
No, yeah, we could do that study. If someone will fund that, we could do that study. But my experience seeing how work like Dean Radin's is produced, the answer, every year it seems, at your conference, someone will say, well, exceptional claims require exceptional proof. And so p-values 10 to the minus 6th, not enough. To the minus 8th, not enough. Minus 15th, not enough. Is there any, his data, it's 10 to the minus 18th, I think, at this point now. So at what point do you say, wow, that's exceptional data? Again, the argument for me is if the bar is always being reset by the skeptics that it's not sufficient, I don't want to embark on that experiment because whatever I find, it's still not going to be good enough.
Well, it isn't for the skeptics. It's a scientific question.
I don't want this to just
I mean, you've just put forward a hypothesis that maybe memories are stored in neural nodules in the heart. That seems entirely possible to me. Okay, so... Okay, so...
Okay, listen. We don't
but I had one question for you, Deepak.
I just want to say one thing, though. Before we get into these extraordinary experiences, we haven't solved a basic problem. How do we experience anything?
Anything, right.
I mean, how do I experience a three-dimensional reality by ingesting photons into my system? We haven't explained normal experience, so forget about extrasensory experience or out-of-body experiences. We cannot explain an in-body experience. How do you have an in-body experience without being in it?
Well, however it's going to
do
be
you think
explained
you're
by
there,
neuroscience.
by the way? Are you there? Am I speaking to someone?
Yeah, I think so.
So
I'm reasonably confident.
There? You know, who is there, and where is this person that I'm speaking to?
We know for sure that down to every last twitch and laugh, it's related to neural activity. We know
neural
this.
correlates
because if you
are
take,
not neural causation.
Well, but they're reasonable. We do make causal connections from correlations.
I wake up every morning when the sun rises. I do not assume that my waking up causes the sun to rise.
Okay, so the last time I was here, you had Rama give a talk, and he talked about his split brain patients. And he talked about the famous one where, I forget what the woman was, either a believer or an atheist before, and then when he did the split brain, one was an atheist and the other one was a believer. If mind was just a separate thing from brain, why would splitting the brain split the mind?
Switch on, switch off.
I don't know what that means.
I can turn off the
But
lights.
you're saying the mind exists separate from the brain.
Can I comment very quickly?
You have to distinguish the switch, what's the switch to gain access to the event from the event itself. So we're saying, yes, we understand very well the switches that get to access to certain experiences and events, but how these events, experiences are stored is still the question. Getting to the neural array for a visual experience, how does a neural array explain a complex emotion of both joy and sorrow at the same time when you're remembering a certain event? So there's these complex feelings and emotions, and we're saying, how are these stored? How do you store complex emotions? How do you store certain feelings? Never mind a vision, that might be easy. And this is where I think this is the biggest question in neuroscience going forward. We just can't, come up with a good answer. Maybe it will be microtubules. How will microtubules store a feeling?
I think we all agree on that. So that's not a subject to a debate, that particular issue.
But it addresses this about split brain. We're saying that you can have split brain, split
I think what
mind
Michael was saying
simply
was
because you have different switches.
the person, once the brain was split, one side of the brain was an atheist and one side was a believer. So the question was, if the brain is only a reflection of some mind that's not residing in the brain, why are there now two minds when the physical brain was split?
Give it to Bernardo.
Why does one switch turn on this light and one switch turns on?
No, it's not. I'm assuming that what was being expressed was what the mind, not the brain, believed. It's not. That's right. It seems like it's two people. So why does splitting the brain turn you into two people when the brain is just a reflection of your being?
Can I generalize your criticism? Because I think it's a very good criticism. I would generalize that by saying, how do you explain that any physical intervention at all, be it surgery, physical trauma to the head, or drugs, how can that influence subjective experience? Is it a fair generalization of what you just said?
I didn't understand.
Okay, you're saying a patient in which the corpus callosum was severed has two centers of consciousness. That's a physical intervention.
Actually, I'm not. I'm saying that in this case, there was a person, and once it was severed, that person had two.
How many cases like that do we know, to repeat Michael's objection? It's just an anecdote, isn't it? I'd like to see a controlled study on that.
I don't know. Rama said he had one.
I even grant that this is true. I'm just generalizing. Your question is, how can physical intervention to the brain alter subjective experience?
No, you're missing the point. That is not the question. The question is the assumption is that there's a mind, it's outside the brain, and that if we see some neural correlates of consciousness, that is merely somewhat irrelevant reflection of what is going on in this mind. Now the question is, if that's true, why does changing the brain seem to change the mind?
Yes.
This person now is half atheist and half non-atheist.
So if the brain is inside an objective mind, in other words, a mind that is not under the control of our personal will, then the brain is the image of a process in that mind. That's all there is to it. Now, if all reality is in mind, the fact that physical intervention in the brain, be it physical trauma, surgery, or drugs, can alter your subjective experience is no more surprising than the fact that your thoughts can alter your emotions, or that your emotions can alter your thoughts. Because all reality, then, are images of processes in consciousness. Some of those processes happen to correlate with the localization of consciousness. That's the brain. That's biology. It leads to our localized perspective into reality. If you sever your brain in two, you sever that localization in two. If all is in mind, and you don't implicitly assume a form of dualism, there should be no problem in the question that you're raising. It's all explained, explainable, under the framework of mentation alone.
Change the neurocircuitry in the brain.
Vikram,
certain belief systems that were there before may be gone simply because the circuitry is no longer in the same order. So it's not creating a new mind. It may just be deleting.
By the way, do you realize that we're all using dualistic language right now? The brain and mind, huh? We're all of us are. You are, and so are we, brain and mind. if we want to go non-dual, there's only one question. Is it all matter, or is it something that's not material? But otherwise, this brain mind will never get us anywhere, okay? Because we are already using dualistic language, which nobody believes in dualism anymore.
Well, if you say that the only thing I know that I can be sure of is my consciousness,
Say
actually,
that again?
the only thing I can be sure of is my consciousness. But actually, you have to go beyond that. I can be sure only of my consciousness. I can't be sure that you exist either, right? So each of us is only sure that we exist, and the rest of us could be illusions. And I agree, you can go that far. I can't prove that that's not true. The question is, how useful is it to think that way?
It's not, we're not saying that there is my consciousness and your consciousness, and, you know, when we say one mind, it really means one mind.
You're not saying that, but I'm telling you that I cannot be sure that you really exist. All I know is my own experience.
When Bernard says that if it is one reality, let's call it one reality, that manifests in what appear to be opposites, complementary. It's just the way the reality is. It appears always as opposites, but they're not. They're a figment of the mind.
Yeah, I mean, you're saying that, but that's your opinion.
You
Okay,
know,
I understand from your point.
Are all these neural networks kind of arguing with each other right now?
No, I think his point is valid because he's not begging the question of what I'm putting forward. He's saying, okay, my experience is my own. I do not grant you, Bernardo, that there is such a thing as objective consciousness out there because all I know is my own experience. What reason do I have to believe otherwise? In other words, what you're saying is that it all boils down to solipsism, if we go as far.
Yeah, well, I'm actually saying that what you're saying boils down to that.
Yeah.
I'm saying that
it doesn't, and
yeah.
I'll explain to you why it doesn't. There are very good empirical reasons for me to believe that you also have your private stream of consciousness. In other words, that not only you are in my consciousness, but that you are conscious as well. Those empirical reasons are, your body is entirely analogous to mine. The image
Entirely what?
Analogous to mine. You have the same organ
That's
systems.
in your imagination, perhaps.
If you go as far, then we have to discard empiricism completely. If you grant that empiricism is valid, all we have to go with is observation. I observe that you are analogous to me. I also observe in myself that a lot of my behaviors are explainable to me by the fact that I am conscious. I see you manifesting those same behaviors, and that's not complete. And you are physically analogous to me. The simplest explanation for these two entirely isomorphic phenomena is that you are conscious too. I can't say that about a chair. I can't say that about a rock.
These are all your assumptions and your taste of where to draw the line, whether it's within yourself or on the outside.
No, this is a logical case. It's not merely postulates. I'm arguing on a logical basis with you, grounded on observation.
You cannot prove that I exist. You can only say that you perceive that I exist, and that might actually not be true.
I grant that solipsism is the most skeptical position possible. But it is not the most reasonable or parsimonious from an empirical perspective.
Okay, so we agree, but in my opinion, yours is also not the most reasonable and parsimonious perspective.
You're entitled to any opinion you want to have. I will not dispute that.
Can I add one remark from an outsider? I really know nothing about neuroscience and all that. But it seems to me that you, for instance, and probably all of you, accept that there are, besides your own consciousness, there are others. So what's the problem with accepting that there is a real world outside of which our brain forms a certain image?
Because it's
What's
an
wrong with
inference
that?
of a...
So, for instance, by using these photons and combining it with other experiences that come through touching, feeling, and all that.
I understand the
question.
question.
Find
If
that
I
image,
grant,
though.
If I grant,
I can't find that image in the brain.
No, but let me try to stay with him.
Okay, maybe not the brain.
Let me
maybe
try to stay with you.
But
maybe it's in the pineal gland, like Descartes thought.
By granting that you are conscious, I'm merely granting another instance of a category that I know to exist in myself. by granting reality to be outside consciousness, I have to infer an entirely different ontological category. It's a much bigger logical step than to grant that you are conscious. It's very different.
Okay, I think we'll take one or two more questions. So let me see.
Can I speak?
Go ahead, Vikram Sequeira.
Hi, thanks for everything, guys. This is great. I have a two-part question. First, I think one of you said that memories can be created. So I'm curious as to the reverse of that, which is, can memory be erased? And I guess the second part is more of an ethical question. And if we're at that point or get to that point soon, should we use that technique for victims of trauma or PTSD?
Rudy, do you want to answer that question? Well, he said, can memories be erased?
Well, access to memories can be erased. Access to memories can be erased. I think we have to...
But wait, in your own research on Alzheimer's, the memories are gone, right?
Access to memories is different than memories.
Right. I'm saying, doesn't Alzheimer's destroy the memory? It's gone.
Yes. So in Alzheimer's, what correlates with dementia is loss of synapses. Synapses need to fire to recall information. It's a different thing to say you've lost the memory versus I've lost the synapse that allows me to recall the memory.
Oh,
we still don't know until we answer the earlier questions about how memory is stored, what's really happening in an Alzheimer's patient other than losing synapses to recall memories or to learn.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I have some anecdotal evidence from my mother, who's 92 and has lost much of her memory, that every once in a while, some weird memory that I would swear was lost gets recalled from nowhere, and then, of course, it's gone again. So I don't know how one would even study that, but...
Yeah, but there's a lot of redundancy. There are so many different ways to recall the same memory, so many different pathways. You may lose the first 5 that were most commonly used, but then one day you hit that 9th one that was still there. But this is still all dealing with access and recall. It still doesn't address the question of how the memories are stored or where they are. That's still the open question, I think.
Okay, I think, what time is it now?
10:10.
10:10. We should probably close it because we're not going to solve the heart problem tonight. Okay?
It will only be an anecdote.
It'll only be an anecdote. Yep. We are still using dualistic language. I was going to say I smashed my radio set. What happened to the music? But then I realized I'm still being dualistic. Okay? The body is in consciousness. The mind is in consciousness. The universe is in consciousness. If there is something outside of consciousness, we will never have access to it. Thank you and good night.